But I'd like to welcome our speaker, who is Brian Sitch, who's the Deputy Head of Collections at Manchester Museum. And he's going to talk about the hidden history of Manchester's links with China, which I think it will be excellent. We're also getting the information about all the online activities that are going on at the museum whilst it's closed for a major new building that they're producing, which will be very exciting, come on later next year. There's also one other thing. We've also got a guest from China, Anna Wang. Would you like to wave, Anna? Can you hear us? Anna, could you wave? Just say hello to people.
Hello, everyone. I come from China. I'm Chinese. I like Manchester City, and I have very good friend in Manchester City.
Well, okay, you can mute yourself now. Thank you. Well, which is I think that's the first for our talks anyway, and you're very welcome to be here. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Brian, and we'll see how this goes. And first of all, he's going to share the screen with you. Okay, over to you, Brian.
I hope everybody can hear me. Just give me a wave, Bernard, if I'm coming through loud and clear. Okay, thank you, Bernard, for that welcome. Thank you to Chorlton Good Neighbours for inviting me. And if you're listening in Zai Zhonghua, Ni hao, wa hen gao xing jian ni. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the history of Manchester's hidden links with China. It's a piece of research that I've been involved with over the last couple of years, and this is preparation for the opening of a new Chinese gallery in autumn 2022. And I should say that this research that I carried out was funded about 18 months ago by Headley Trust with Art Fund. I think it's very true to say that Chinese people are a very important part of the cultural diversity of Manchester. They've made their home here over many, many years. And equally, people from Manchester went to China. They went to China as missionaries, soldiers, traders, diplomats. We have a couple of fantasists who claim that they went to China, but we can find no evidence that they actually went, but they too have very interesting stories. And equally at this time in the second half of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, people in Manchester would have watched spectacular fireworks displays at Bellevue Zoo, some of them featuring a commemoration, if you want, of British campaigns in different parts of the world, including China. And of course, during the First World War, Chinese people, Chinese men particularly, made a very vital contribution to the Allied war effort by working as labourers in northern France. And people from Lancashire were actually recruited as commanders, officers of Chinese cultural battalions, Chinese Labour Corps battalions who served during the First World War. And of course, this may still just about be in people's living memory, but there is the very famous case of a Manchester missionary who was famously captured by the Red Army during the mid-1930s and disappeared and was feared to have been killed, but miraculously managed to survive. So in all these ways, our relationship with China is preserved within the memory of the city, and one might say the very fabric of the city. I can see a hand up from Margaret. Is that
oh, a question? Yes. Could I just say that Alfred Bossart, when he was a child, was told by his doctor that he wouldn't live very long, and he lived to be over 90 despite the long march.
Yes, yeah, I'll come to Alfred because he's a fascinating.
Oh, you are going to? Yes, sorry.
I fear you're anticipating, Margaret, but never mind. It's a good point to raise. I mentioned fantasists in my introduction, and I'd like to kick off with John Hilditch, who was obsessed with China. He had this massive collection in his home. Well, not his home, but he had a base at in Crumpsall called Minglands, and it had something like 60,000 Chinese and Japanese antiques and antiquities. And he made great claims for the value of this collection. He claimed, this is the 1920s, that he claimed it was worth up to £1 million. And sadly, that was not confirmed on his death at auction. It realized a fraction of that amount. He made some extravagant claims about the circumstances in which he collected this material. Stories about being buried up to his neck by irate Chinese villagers whose cemeteries he'd been excavating, looking for antiques and so on, and being rescued by a faithful manservant in the middle of the night when the villagers had retired. And of course, we don't have the least evidence that he ever went to China at all. So he's a fascinating character, and not least because at one point he tried to persuade Manchester Art Gallery to put his collection on display, and they declined. And he held a bit of a grudge against them, so much so that he actually organized a hoax. Some of his friends dressed in Chinese costume and pretended to be part of a visiting delegation. And they were on very thin ice indeed when some real Chinese people actually came into the frame, and they had to very quickly make their escape. And Hilditch was always very kind of shamefaced about this and rather sheepish about this. But I think it was done because he felt embarrassed that the art gallery didn't want to put on display his beloved collection. These stories obviously survive in the form of newspaper cuttings and archives in places like Chetham's Library and Central Library. And I know that Chorlton Good Neighbours include a good number of local historians, so I hope these will be things that you might like to follow up. But this is one of the stories that we would like to tell in our new Chinese Culture Gallery, which is celebrating some of these links between Manchester and China. Margaret raised the issue of raised a point about Alfred Bossart, and I found this an astonishing story. He was born in Manchester, although he retained his Swiss citizenship. He, from a very early age, had a vocation to be a missionary and went to China and was in China during the late 20s and 30s. He met his wife there. She was a missionary and they got married. She was French, so Alfred had a working knowledge of French, which later came in extremely handy when he was captured by the Communist Army, which was then in the early stages of the Long March. And Alfred, amazingly, was able to help the General Shao Ke and his army by translating the French names on a missionary map that had fallen into the hands of the Chinese army. And by translating these names, Alfred was able to help the Chinese army escape from the nationalists. And this was something I think that was very much remembered by General Shao Ke and appreciated at the time, so much so that Alfred says in some of the recordings that can be listened to in the Manchester Library, he says that the two men, although they were divided by nationality and politics and ideology, that the two actually came to respect one another. And Alfred must have been utterly astonished when 50 years later, when Alfred was living quietly in retirement in Manchester, when General Shao Ke, out of the blue, contacted him and said, "I've been looking for you for a long time," because, and had been unable to find Alfred because the general had always thought that Alfred was French because of his working knowledge of the French names on the map that they'd used some 50 years earlier to escape from the nationalists. And of course, Alfred was held for a very long time. He was held 18 months as a prisoner. He suffered many harrowing experiences and was very, very fortunate to survive. And he put his survival down to the fact that God had protected him, had restrained the hands of his enemies. And this is actually the title of the several books that were published after Alfred's release. So it's an astonishing story. And one of the missionary collections that we visited a couple of years ago actually has some of the clothing. I don't think for one second that this is the clothing that Alfred wore in China, but it is Chinese style clothing that I think Alfred wore in Manchester when he joined his Chinese friends for meetings and social gatherings. Another couple of missionaries that we discovered during our research were the Reverend Edgar and Sally Dewstow, and some of their costume material, the collections of tiny shoes for women wearing bound feet are preserved in Whitworth Art Gallery. But we found one or two very interesting Chinese antiquities in Manchester Museum's collection as well. So down at the bottom there, you can see a votive model of a Chinese house or tomb made out of clay and fired in the kiln. The picture, by the way, shows Sally and Reverend Edgar at the opening of a new Christian church at Wen Chai in Hong Kong. Sadly, I think this was demolished some years ago, but we can find photographs of it online. Talking about fantasists, this is an even more astonishing story. As the story of a man called Maurice Abraham Cohen, who didn't come from Manchester. He came from London's East End. He was of the Jewish religion, and he was a bit of a tearaway as a young lad, and got sent to Canada to reform his ways. And we think somewhere down the line, perhaps in Edmonton, he either befriended or was befriended by members of the Chinese community, and he retained very close relationship. I think perhaps because both Maurice and members of the Chinese community at that time were perhaps somewhat, shall we say, socially marginalized. And sorry, I can see that Margaret has her hand up again. Margaret, did you want to come in there? No, you're still on mute, Margaret. But perhaps I could take questions at the end.
Oh, it's just that little playhouse may well have been put in a grave. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Maurice Cohen had some very interesting connections, close connections with the Chinese community in Canada. And perhaps on the strength of those, during the 1920s, when he went to China to follow up on a business deal, he was able to secure an introduction to Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the leading Chinese revolutionary who became the first head of state. Sorry, Margaret, I can see you've got your hand up again.
I'm terribly sorry. That I accidentally knocked it. I had no idea I'd done that. Sorry.
Okay, perhaps we could take questions at the end. And
I understand that.
We'll try and deal with them all together.
Good idea.
So Dr. Sun Yat-sen, I'm sure many people will know of the famous story of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and how he was kidnapped in the centre of London and held a prisoner and might well have been executed, but was saved by the intervention of Sir Cantley, Edward Cantley, and his wife, and rescued from captivity. Sorry, forgive me. So Maurice actually became the bodyguard of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And after Dr. Sun Yat-sen died, he became a very close associate of leading members of the Chinese government at the time. And here at the bottom, we can see some photographs that are in the Manchester Library collection, Manchester Archives collection. You see this larger, well, almost seemingly a giant man sitting in the midst of a group of, I think every one of them are members of the Chinese government, the Chinese authorities of the time. This European man sitting somewhat incongruously in the middle, and this is Maurice Cohen. He was always very, I think, proud of his Chinese associations and retained very close relations with the government, even after it's changed. So here we have a gathering many years later, where I don't know if you can see my pointer, standing to the gentleman standing behind Mao Zedong there. And this is Maurice Cohen. And on the strength of the fact that he'd served the earlier revolutionary government, Maurice retained a very close, I think, relationship with the communist authorities and was able to go there when it was not possible for many other Europeans to travel there. Maurice had an unusual nickname, sometimes referred to as Two Gun Cohen. That's because he had I think in one of his visits out with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he was wounded in the arm, and because of that felt that it'd be very useful if you had a gun on each side, two holsters, so if he was wounded, he could retrieve a weapon using the uninjured hand or arm. And of course, this made him a little bit of a figure of humor to the expatriate community, who referred to him as Two Gun Cohen, because he would be seen in public with a gun on each side of his hip. So Maurice had some, shall we say, ceremonial titles. Again, one of them being general, but we don't know that he ever commanded Chinese soldiers in action. But he was certainly highly respected because of his close connections. And I think on that basis, when sadly he died many years later, he was then living in Manchester or Salford. He was buried in the Jewish cemetery at Blackley. And if you're able to visit, you can see this beautiful tombstone inscribed partly with a Mandarin inscription from Madame Sung, the widow of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. It's a very moving, I think, testament to the very close relationship between Maurice and the Chinese authorities, particularly Madame Sung. It's quite a moving story, I think. Another gentleman closely associated with Manchester is Frank Kingdon Ward. He was born here. His father was a lecturer in botany. Frank seems to have maintained that interest in botany by going out to China to take part in expeditions. And then he was commissioned by bees over, well, what is now Ness Botanical Garden near Liverpool, and he was commissioned to go out to China as a plant hunter. At this time, there was considerable interest in Chinese plants because China was a hotspot for botanical diversity in the world. Something like 8 or 10% of the world's botanical diversity can be found in China. That sounds like a relatively small amount, but it's very, very significant in botanical terms. And people like Frank went out to China and they were collecting specimens and particularly seed with the aim of sending them back to the nurseries where these seeds could be propagated, and the plants would be sold to local gardening enthusiasts so that they would grow something that perhaps hadn't been seen in gardens in the vicinity ever. So these plant hunters made quite a significant impact, shall we say, on British gardens by introducing plants and trees and decorative shrubs that otherwise we wouldn't know about. And some of these have become, shall we say, British stalwarts. So we might think of them as traditional, so things like peony, for instance, originated in China. So Frank's big discovery, of course, was the blue poppy, Meconopsis speciosa. And you can see in this picture, top right, an illustration of the poppy. Another plant hunter who's preserved in the Manchester collections is, well, not literally, the plants he collected are preserved, is Augustine Henry. He was a customs official and spent his spare time, and he developed this as a hobby at weekends and to keep himself occupied in the evenings because he had otherwise nothing else to do, and sent specimens back to Kew and other collections. And thanks to him, we have some very fine preserved fern specimens from southwest China in particular. And one of the people he worked with was a field worker called Old Ho, or Old Lao. And he had a very, beg your pardon, Lao Ho. I had a very close relationship with him, was very, very upset when Ho sadly passed away during fieldwork. Another gentleman with a Manchester link is Paul Hogarth, the artist. He attended Manchester School of Art during the 1930s and was able to visit China after the revolution with a group of other artists. And we can see here on the right some of the sketches that were released and published. And I think it's a great tragedy that we're not able to locate some of the originals of these works, because we would love to show them in our exhibition, but sadly the only record we have is the publication looking at China. Hopefully some of these will come to light in due course. As I say, we'd really like to show them in the exhibition, not least because they show ordinary Chinese people carrying out everyday activities at work, in factories and so on, or farmers. And there is a real sense of these people looking back at you with tremendous dignity. The pride in their work is, I think, very evident through Paul Hogarth's sketches. Now, I mentioned Bellevue Zoo earlier, and of course, in many ways, this has become somewhat, shall we say, unpalatable in these times. The empire and, shall we say, British military successes in different parts of the world that gave rise to imperial acquisitions, and the record of these obviously can be seen in museum collections around the world, but particularly in the UK and other European countries and America. And Bellevue Zoo had a part in promoting some of these events, these campaigns, these military successes through extravagant firework displays. Not all of the displays were based in China, of course. They celebrated military successes all around the world, but we can find examples of something like six separate celebrations, shall we say, one of them going back to 1860 and the Yuan Ming Yuan, the destruction of the Summer Palace. And not all of these depictions of Chinese people are unsympathetic. If you look at the descriptions in the newspapers of the time, some of them quite sympathetic to the Chinese emperor at the time of the plundering of the Yuan Ming Yuan. But for us, it's a really interesting social, historical record of something that was, I think, really important in Manchester, that would draw many comers of the Manchester population and from far afield, visiting Manchester on day trips and special tickets by coming in by train. It was quite spectacular, and the fireworks could be seen from miles around. We know some of the Chinese depictions covered things like the siege of Peking, the storming of the Taku forts, or as I say, the destruction of the Summer Palace. And of course, at Bellevue Zoo, once you'd enjoyed the entertainments, you could go and enjoy some refreshments in the special Chinese cafe. And this is a postcard bottom left, giving an artist's impression of what that cafe looked like, complete with Chinese lanterns hanging from the rafters and so on. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time, if I may, just talking about, I think, a story that is just so moving. It has to be at the heart of any empathic or empathetic approach to building better understanding between different cultures and different communities. This is really at the heart of our Chinese Culture Gallery. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the story of Charles and Adela Weishan. And the story is that Charles, this is after the Chinese Revolution of 1911, Charles was one of those young Chinese students who came out to the West to study science and technology. The Chinese then investing huge amounts in improving and modernizing the country after the years of Manchu rule. And Charles, or Qian, to give him his Chinese name, boarded with a London family called the Warburtons. They took in boarders, and Charles would attend college during the day and go back and board with the Warburtons. And the Warburtons had a number of daughters, and the eldest was called Adela. And the two fell in love and they got married. And we might think, well, in 1911, this must have been quite an astonishing thing. But they were married, they had a daughter. And when Charles returned to China to work in Chengdu as the head of communications, Adela followed him after the birth of the first daughter. And they lived together in Chengdu very happily. They had 3 more daughters. But I think we can be fairly confident that this was not with the approval of the expatriate community. We know that mixed marriages were very much, well, relationships, let alone marriages, were very much frowned upon by Europeans living in China. And in fact, one of the appalling things that we've read as part of our research is that European women, white women who formed relations with Chinese men were condemned. They were accused of committing the unpardonable sin for which there is no atoning. And it's quite I'd like to think our more tolerant and liberated age, you know, we look back on expressions like this with very much contempt and horror and condemn them. If you'd like to know more about these stories, there is a number of blogs that you can look up online on the museum website. You can share this later, I think, but it's on the screen right now if you want to capture it. Now, this story has a sad ending, I'm afraid, because that part of China was very much caught up in civil war during the early 1920s, and both Charles and Adela had to flee with their family of 4 young daughters, and tragically, Adela died on the way to Shanghai, and Charles had to very quickly make arrangement for the 2 youngest daughters. The 2 eldest were sent to boarding school, but the 2 youngest daughters were adopted by this man, Samuel Cornell Plant, who with his wife had lived on the upper Yangtze in a riverboat and had a Chinese crew. And I suspect this is a somewhat unconventional story too, and maybe why the Plants had formed some kind of friendship with Adela and Charles during their years living in Chengdu. And the Plants, who were quite, well, shall we say, of mature age, they had adopted the 2 youngest girls with the intention of taking them home to the UK as their adoptive daughters. Of course, I should point out that Captain Plant had been invited to go to China by Archibald Little, who had come up with the idea originally of pioneering the use of steamships on the upper Yangtze. And this is another Manchester connection that's very, very interesting. Sadly, both Captain Plant and his wife passed away within days of each other, just as they were about to leave China for the UK. And the 2 youngest daughters, well, provision had to be made for them. And rather than continuing the journey to the UK to be brought up by Captain Plant's family, they were put ashore, and they were actually brought up by a missionary. And they regarded, the 2 youngest daughters regarded this woman, treated her as their mother, because they'd been very, very young when they were adopted. And they didn't actually know about their family history, knew very little about it. But I'm very pleased to say that the great granddaughter of Adela and Charles is an American researcher, and has put this story together painstakingly. Her name is Polly Scher-Brandmeier, and with Polly's very kind permission, we've been allowed to tell this story as part of the gallery. And I think if there's no other story in what I'm saying that will move you, then you know, this is the one. This is at the heart, I think, the emotional heart of the new Chinese Culture Gallery, because it's very much about identifying with people and their personal experiences, and through that sense of empathy, we come to understand one another better. And in this way, we hope there will be better relations between communities. So I hope you'll agree with me. This is a very, very touching, very, very moving story. Moving on, another connection that we can make between Manchester and China is that of a Lancashire officer who was one of the commanders of a company of the Chinese Labour Corps during the latter part of the First World War. This is Lieutenant Thomas Walsh. He came from quite a humble background. He'd been a mill worker, but again, surprisingly, somehow he must have been something very, very talented. Something about the man that attracted the interest and support of benefactors. But Thomas was able to go to what would become the University of Manchester, and where he studied modern languages, including German, French, and Mandarin. And this came in very, very handy during the latter part of the First World War, when the British Army advertised for people with experience of Mandarin to present themselves potentially as officers to serve with companies of the Chinese Labour Corps. And of course, we all know about the terrible casualties of the first years of the First World War. The British Army was finding it very difficult to find sufficient manpower. And it was at this point that China offered about 100,000 Chinese men, not to fight, but to serve behind the lines by moving munitions and foodstuffs. They were also laying railway lines, they were digging trenches, they were creating airfields, they were even mending tanks. So they were doing a really important job and releasing men who could then serve on the front line, who would otherwise have been doing these tasks behind the lines. And we know that Thomas must have had quite a close relationship with the Chinese workers that he commanded, because at the end of the war, they gave him this very special honorific or 10,000 word or 10,000 name umbrella to show their appreciation of him. Very, very few officers receive these. And I suspect this may be one of the very few honorific umbrellas that were presented at that time to survive in museum collections. I'd love to know if there are any more out there. Sadly, this umbrella has lost its ribbons with all the names that you would have expected to see. We're conducting a hunt of the collections to see if they've survived somewhere, but we haven't yet found them. But we were so pleased last year to find the great grandnephew of Thomas Walsh. And he very kindly provided the museum with a photograph of his illustrious ancestor. And not only that, some photographs of the Chinese men who'd served in that particular company of the Chinese Labour Corps. And some of the names we know because they're annotated on the photographs. And we would love to be able to connect with or trace the families of some of these men, but apparently the surnames are quite common, so that may be a very difficult thing for us to do. I should point out, of course, that it's not only a case of people from Manchester going out to China, but also we have examples of Chinese people coming to live in Manchester. We have very vibrant, very active Chinese communities here today. We know the stories of some of these men from looking at our collections. This is the botanical collection of Mr. Y.U. Lee, who very kindly gave his collection to our museum herbarium a few years ago. Mr. Lee came to the UK originally during the 1960s. He worked like many Chinese incomers do, initially in the food industry. He was a Chinese waiter in a restaurant, and he made sufficient money to set up his own business in Rochdale. And quite apart from doing this, he retained his interest in botany. He'd done some collecting in China, and he continued to collect in the UK. And on his retirement, he went back to Hong Kong, but he gave his collection to Manchester Museum, for which we're very grateful. You can see one of the samples, one of the specimens from his collection, top right, and also a picture of Mr. Li actually collecting in the field, possibly 1940s, 1950s. I'm sorry to say that during his time in Rochdale, Mr. Li, shall we say, suffered a degree of aggravation that must have made his years in the city a little bit uncomfortable, and so things like people leaving, not paying, and sometimes breaking the windows of his shop, and it's very regrettable. He now lives in Hong Kong, and our hope is that if we're able to resume our direct flights with China, and it's possible to visit China after lockdown, then we may be able to go and make a filmed interview with Mr. Li. I'm sure you would have many interesting things to tell us. Another Chinese visitor to the city is Mr. Li Yuanqia, whose work is preserved in the art gallery's collections. He was very much an avant-garde Chinese artist. You can see one of his hand-colored photographs at the bottom of this slide. Very interestingly, he initially made his home very close to Hadrian's Wall, which I suspect must have had memories of perhaps Chinese Great Wall for him. And he had an art center called the Li Yuanqia Center. And when he retired, when he passed away, this center closed, and his collections were acquired by the art gallery, and they include things like sculpture, painting, and pottery. Again, very, very fascinating character we'd love to know more about. So I'd like to draw to a close there, if I may, and say that obviously we live in a changing world. China has really come onto the world stage economically and politically since some of the events I've been talking about in this presentation this afternoon. And obviously part of that more assertive China has led to tensions with the United States and indeed Europe and Great Britain. Regardless of these geopolitical tensions, Manchester as a city very much values its connections with China. We welcome those connections. For instance, Chinese students come to the University of Manchester. We have one of the largest populations of Chinese students in the UK, if not Western Europe, and that bodes very well, I think, for future connections between Manchester and China. These obviously are all very, very recent or relatively recent developments over the last couple of decades, but we often forget, I think, that our connections with China go way back, back to the mid-19th century, if not before, and that Manchester and indeed Lancashire, particularly the cotton mills, looked to China as a potential market for the sale of cotton goods, textiles, and so on. And even then, Manchester was looking towards China as a very important market and a source of economic commercial income. And so I guess there's really nothing new that's under the sun, is there? In a way, we're kind of coming back to a position we were in the 19th century. And it's because of that, I think there's always been a very strong tradition of teaching Chinese and Mandarin and Cantonese within the city, because Manchester merchants clearly valued these connections and wanted to be in a good position to make the best use of potential sales to China by knowing the language of the people that they were negotiating with. So I hope this talk is, and really I called it hidden history. It's not really hidden, because you really only have to do a little bit of scratching under the surface for these quite remarkable, astonishing stories to come to the fore. And I find some of them very touching and some of them deeply moving. I hasten to say that these are the kinds of stories that we want to tell in our new Chinese Culture Gallery that will open in a year's time. It's been very generously funded by Dr. Lee Kai-hung, who's a Manchester Chinese businessman. Dr. Lee's wishes and indeed the mission of the museum are for there to be better understanding between different cultures and communities. And so we hope that by telling these stories, by featuring these narratives, very often stories that lie behind the objects in our own collections and the collections of other institutions across the city, we can give people perhaps a better understanding to enable them to put themselves in the shoes of a European or somebody from Manchester in China, or perhaps a Chinese person who's come to live and work in Manchester. And through that empathic or empathetic approach, we hope that there will be more understanding between us, for there to be more tolerance for people from different parts of the world with different cultures who may speak different languages. But this connection with China is very deep rooted and very special to the city and is meaningful to us in all sorts of ways. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was fantastic and some really interesting case studies you gave. Could you stop sharing now so we can see people?
By all means.
Right. Okay, everybody, you can if you've got any question you'd like to ask, if you could either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and say who you are.
I just wanted to say a very big thank you because it was really interesting. And I'm very sorry my hand went up a couple of times when I didn't mean to. I've never used the hand before, but I got a bit carried away and I was writing my notes and suddenly I saw it was there. So thank you, it was excellent.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your appreciation.
Yeah.
Brian, can I ask you about, there's also a history of the Chinese community in Manchester. Are you doing anything on that? Because it is a very significant community.
Yeah, certainly. And we know a great deal. Some of the first Chinese people to come to the city travelled here from places like Liverpool, where there's a very, very strong tradition of Chinese seamen coming ashore and to stay in between jobs at sea and forming relationships and having families. There's a very tragic story, for instance, about the forcible repatriation of Chinese seamen after the Second World War, who having helped the British war effort during the Second World War, were actually sent home against their will. They were literally pulled off the streets, and their own wives and children believed that they'd been abandoned by their Chinese fathers, who'd been sent home back to China. And this is still an ongoing source of many painful memories for these families. But that is not so much Manchester's story. It's more of a Liverpool story. Although some of those families came to Manchester. We know, for instance, after the Chinese Revolution, people from southern China, members of the Hakka community, came, and some of them worked in textiles. Some of them were working in laundries. We have a little bit of information about some of these people. People who later would set up Chinese food supermarkets, and even the origins of Chinese traditional medicine practices within the city, which are very, they are part of the city's medical landscape, shall we say, and the very people who would be so supportive of the creation of Manchester's Chinatown and the building of the Arch. So these are all really important stories. And forgive me if I don't touch on them directly in this presentation, but it's almost a presentation in itself.
Well, that's a good reason for doing one on them later in the year, next year. And certainly we can all look forward to the reopening of the museum in October next year. Is that correct?
Yeah, I hesitate to give you a precise date there, knowing about often these projects can be bedeviled by delays, contractual issues, and so on. But that's we're working to a date in the autumn, hopefully October. Yeah.
Right. Any final last question? Oh, yes, Kate.
The University of Liverpool has strong links with Shanghai. Has Manchester University got any links with any particular university?
It has. It's we, as a city, Manchester is twinned with Wuhan. Those links go back many years. In fact, there is in the city Wuhan Woods, and if you this was created about 35 years ago, and actually features about a dozen different Chinese species of trees, and been quite intense exchanges between Manchester and Wuhan, civic delegations visiting one another, students from different educational institutions coming, and the University of Manchester obviously very much encourages and welcomes Chinese students to come to the city. As I said, we've got one of the largest Chinese student populations in the country, if not Western Europe. So this is a very positive thing, and the students are making a significant contribution to our gallery. We have several young Chinese students who've been working with us on the development of the new gallery. We recently acquired by transfer some Chinese material from another collection, and the Chinese students worked with us to get a better understanding of that material, and being very, very supportive, particularly of our work with Chinese communities as well. So this I think all bodes very well. I mean, just on a personal note, I might say that my first ever visit to China in the autumn of 2018 was one of the things that made it very special, was connecting with academics at the Hubei Institute of Art, and we're hoping in our new gallery to feature a very large Chinese landscape painting by Professor Qing Ling, who's the husband of one of the academics that I met on that 2018 visit.
Jane, have you got a question? Your hands.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I think you've partly answered my question already, but you referred quite a bit to the new gallery that will open in October 2022, and I just wondered if there's anything more you can say to us about what will be in that gallery.
Yeah, certainly, because this is a hot topic for us. I was in a meeting with colleagues earlier this morning. We were talking about responding to some preliminary design drawings by the team of designers, image makers, who are based in the southwest in Devon, Cornwall, I believe. And this is a 200-meter gallery. It'll be the largest. Well, certainly it'll be the first permanent gallery, but it'll be it's quite a large undertaking, and it will bring together highlights from Chinese collections across the city, including the two art galleries, for instance, and some of the best Chinese objects, most interesting objects from our own collection. We're very much interested in the empathic approach, as I think I've said several times, that we really want people to visit this gallery and to have a better understanding of what it might be like for a Chinese person living in Manchester, and equally to understand some of these very special friendships and relationships that Manchester people, Lancashire people formed with Chinese people, either in China or in this country, or as I said during the First World War even. And through these, by exploring the stories behind the objects, to really come to a better understanding that Chinese people are not a threat to us. They're not exotic. They are not other. They're very similar to us. They have very, very similar feelings about their own families. They cherish and value friendships. There's great interest. They attach great importance to reciprocity, to returning favors, and so on. And this, in many ways, I think, is they're concerned for the environment and steps that they're taking to climate change, for instance. These are all things that we can all identify and should, deserve to be, I think, discussed in the new gallery.
Okay, Paul, final question now.
What was interesting was that I found was the 100,000 Chinese people that came over during the First World War, because you don't hear about that, but were they actually brought over as indentured workers, or
They were, yeah.
volunteered?
Yeah, it's a good question. They entered into contracts and they received a weekly or monthly, a salary effectively. And this was more, perhaps less than a European worker would get, but it was more than they would earn in China, which was an incentive for them. And perhaps some were motivated by a sense of adventure. We don't know. But if they were injured or if they lost their lives, then a payment would be made to families. So for those reasons, they felt that there was some inducement to come and help the Allies. I think China as a country hoped that by contributing to the Allied war effort, that she would be rewarded with German concessions in China. And of course, China felt bitterly betrayed at the end of the First World War in the Treaty of Versailles, when Japan was actually awarded the German concessions. Now, these Chinese laborers, and they're all men, they were shipped across the Pacific. In some cases, they landed in Canada and were railroaded across Canada, and then boarded a ship again to cross the Atlantic, came to Liverpool. And in fact, one or two men were actually suffered illness and passed away on landing. And I think it's about half a dozen graves can be found in Anfield Cemetery. And in 2018, there's very special very special ceremony to commemorate those men. That was organised partly by the Meridian Society, and it was to honour those men, even though sadly they didn't reach northern France. They passed away before they got to France, sadly.
And can I just say thank you very much to Brian for all this, and if we give either a silent or whatever it was.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll hear about maybe the Chinese community in Manchester in more detail next time you're available. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye
for now. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Brian.